Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mentality Project, the Mentality Mondays Healthy Masculinity Conversation Series. I'm Chelsea Hill. I use she and they pronouns. I'm one of the health promotion specialists in the Well for Health Promotion, specializing in sexual health, sexual violence prevention, and men's engagement initiatives here on Tulane campus. And today we're very excited to have Tim Mousseau as our special guest speaker, who is going to be talking about the work that he does to support healthy masculinity and sexual violence prevention. And we also have Magnus, where I'll pass it off to, and we'll get started with today's episode.
Yeah, hey everybody, welcome back. Like Chelsea said, I'm Magnus Dallier. I'm the Mentality Project Coordinator. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a senior psychology major, and I'm very excited to be talking with Tim today. He's actually returning to help with the Mentality Project once again. He was a keynote speaker last fall, and we're very excited to jump into today's conversation and get to pick his brain a little bit more about healthy masculinity and what programming should look like at Tulane's campus.
Alrighty, so I'll get us started off. Basically, an introduction question for you, Tim. Tell us a bit about yourself and the work that you do, and essentially where you're working right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thanks for having me, everyone. As you've heard, my name's Tim. I use he, him, his pronouns. And so I'm excited to continue to get to work with Tulane. I know that throughout my career, I do mostly speaking, research, and curriculum design. And so I have studied and got my start working in sexual violence prevention and was doing kind of education and training around Title IX compliance with that. Part of that comes from my own experience as a survivor of sexual violence. And so I was speaking on that and training on that. And then as a result of that, started to get a lot more interest in talking specifically with men and male identified individuals about not only sexual violence prevention, but also just like masculinity as a whole. And so right now I am spending a lot of time doing research around the topic. So I work primarily with universities and colleges on that kind of topic, and then also do curriculum design. So I help create kind of peer education programs for different colleges and university and write the curriculum that the peer educators then can go use and teach their student organizations. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you talked a little bit about your own experience and how that relates to violence prevention work that you do. You talk a little bit more about what drove you to work on healthy masculinity programming as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think with masculinity, it was something that I saw this very large urge for people to talk about it. And it was something that every time I would lead a program, there was this kind of group that would come up to me, would have conversations around, what are your thoughts on this? What does this mean for you? What does this look like? You know, we're concerned about this, or we're considering this. And there was all these questions that I started to hear time and time again that I think oftentimes dealt with this idea of masculinity. The other piece of it is I think there was a lot of times where I was getting men who were asking for support-based resources that they couldn't find anywhere else, right? So because I work in this kind of field of prevention and wellness, a lot of times there are people who are coming up with questions of just like, hey, I know this isn't around sexual violence, but I have a friend of mine and he is experiencing X, Y, Z, and I don't know how to get him to talk about it. Or he seems to be doing these things and I don't know how to confront him on it or challenge him about these behaviors. And so there felt to be this like really profound need for it. And then I think the other part of it is I've seen some people kind of like, unfortunately, radicalize around masculinity. I think it's a topic that I do believe, especially men, want to talk about. And I think conversations are happening in our society. I also think as I've watched some of our society evolve, what I started to see is there were all these pushes and shifts towards this, like I said, this radicalization of like where people and men felt they were losing their masculinity. And so because of that, I think a lot of them were turning to like these online communities where the dialogue and conversation was very regressive, and sometimes very aggressive in the way they were approaching the topic. And I was watching that happen and unfold, and, you know, it's kind of tied to a variety of events that occurred. But as I watched that, I was like, hey, there has to be a better way to have this conversation. There's got to be another way we can approach this or talk about this, because I see this desire to talk about masculinity. I just don't know if I saw a lot of outlets for people to do it in a way where they were both supported as they went through this journey of kind of exploring masculinity, but also could be comfortably challenged and kind of pushed and nudged in a way of like really considering what it means to think about masculinity.
Thank you for sharing. Sounds like you had several like aha moments, and it's awesome to hear that from your end that you perceive or see that a lot of masculine identified folks want to talk about this, which is another reason why we started this project here on Tulane. So you're speaking a lot about masculinity. And so I'm wondering if you could, define what does masculinity mean to you, and what is your connection to healthy masculinity? And, with that, how does it show up in your work and in your mission behind your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I look at the definition of masculinity, I oftentimes look at some of the kind of traditional research-based definitions of like, it's any of the values, norms, behaviors that we believe and hold as a society to really define someone who's considered to be masculine, right? Which can extend across a variety of groups and extends regardless of like gender expression, gender identity, any of those features. Anyone can express, desire, embody, emulate masculinity in a variety of ways. And so for me, I've always kind of stuck with that definition because I think it works really well just to think about like, hey, if we're talking about what makes someone masculine, these traits that we often assign to, masculine identifying individuals, this is what we think of masculinity. I think at a more personal level, I look at, especially when it comes to like healthy masculinity, I've always talked about and looked at the expression of how we're expressing that masculinity. So for me, the piece I always look at is, we do know that society oftentimes has these very traditional concepts of masculinity, whether it's economic achievement or the type of sex that we're having or physical strength, right? Which I think many men are taught growing up. And that's something that if you are male identifying, you're just expected to adhere to. And as I look at healthy masculinity, I think that it's recognizing that on the individual level, our masculine values aren't necessarily negative as long as they're not causing harm to ourselves or other people, right? So that if you personally believe in like physical strength, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's when you believe in it to a degree that it's hurting someone else or it's hurting yourself and how you're trying to achieve that, that's where it becomes bad. With the healthy masculinity on the collective then as well, I think about it in the capacity of how we're willing to challenge those systems that may not be working for us or systems that are unfairly or inadequately applied, right? Because I think it becomes much different of saying like, individually, if you believe in physical strength, that's fantastic. But once you start to like trickle that outwards and you make it this group norm and expectation for anyone of saying like, hey, anyone who wants to be masculine has to be physically strong, that's where it reaches that unhealthy place of people who can't achieve that or don't want to achieve that, or for whatever reasons just aren't, in alignment with that value. If they're ostracized, if they're, held accountable, if they're mocked, if they're scorned, all these kind of things, that's where I think that degree of like unhealthiness comes in. And so I think from the healthiness on the personal level, it's, hey, I'm making sure I'm not harming myself or others. And then on the kind of general overarching level, it's like, how are we making sure that our masculinity as a society and as groups that we're forming isn't being imposed onto other people, and really accepting of all these very different definitions of what individuals think is masculinity.
Yeah, I think competitiveness and self-sufficiency are also things that fall into that very well, because, we see sort of a pressure, at least in my life, I've experienced that and know many masculine individuals who've also experienced that drive to be competitive, to be, the best that you possibly can in every way, which seems like a good thing. It's just, like you said, a matter of how much does it harm other people or lead you to feel, ostracized or get rejected by your peers because you're unable to line up, And same deal with self-sufficiency, just sort of that idea of being able to handle all those problems on your own without actually reaching out for help or using somebody else as a resource, or even just, turning to something else. It's like we're trying to inherently have all the answers to every possible question and problem we might face without actually being able to do that as a human being. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's interesting. So I guess if you could talk a little bit more about like what your work is trying to achieve specifically, or generally even just sort of what you envision the future of healthy masculinity to look like on college campuses and society at large, individually. What are you trying to achieve for masculine identified individuals and for everyone as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a part of it is to try and provide a framework for how we can have conversations around this topic, right? I mean, masculinity it's a fairly new concept that we're exploring in our society. And I think a lot of people are talking about it. And I think because of that, it at times tends to become this like buzzword that's watered down of, people are just throwing it out and attaching it to things where they're not really thinking about it, but we know that oftentimes for worse, we didn't really study masculinity until, up until the 60s and 70s. For a long time in the history of the world, we just said, this is what it means to be a man, and this is what it means to be a human through the lens of what it means to be a man, right? And so finally, then we started to say, no, let's actually explore these concepts and study it and break it down and realize there's difference to it. And I think so for so many people, it's still such a new idea. And because it's so new and novel, it's kind of one of these things that I just think people don't know how to talk about it, and they just don't know how to have conversations around it, especially in a comfortable level. And so I think that's the first piece, is to try and create this framework of how do we talk about this, and how do you have conversations around this, and especially what does that look like on a generational level, right? Because for our generation, millennials, Generation Z especially, it's something that is becoming much more common to be having these conversations. I oftentimes think about when I speak with members of Generation X or boomers who are they potentially never talked about it their entire life. They were kind of told this is what it means, and then all of a sudden you're actually let's change that. And I think there's this large fear that people have of they're you're taking something from me, and it's no, we're not, we're just talking about it. So I think the first is providing these tools and a framework of here's some ways you can bring this up. And it's different if you're talking with your friends and your peers on campus. It's very different than if you're going home and talking with your parents or even your grandfather around this kind of thing, right? Because every one of us has different generational experiences of what it means to talk about masculinity. And I think from there, it's just trying to really get people to recognize that, as I mentioned, there's these systems that we've inherited that aren't benefiting us, that are literally doing nothing for us or the people around us, that we were just told is what it means to be masculine. And I see so many individuals who are willing to fight for those things. And I think it's trying to get people to recognize hey, maybe this doesn't work, right? And maybe this doesn't exist for a good reason. I think one of the easy examples I like to use is what I call resting bro face. So resting bro face is whenever I'm talking to a group of, men, oftentimes I see this angry look back at me, and every guy in the audience just looks upset and angry and mad. And the reason for it is when I first started speaking, I was oh, these guys really hate me. But then after every program, a guy would come up and be oh, that was great. And he would be the guy who was staring at me the most intensely the entire time, and he would disappear, and I would never hear from him again. And what I realized is it really just comes down to the way men have been socialized. For so many of them, from an early age, we are taught to repress our emotions, especially on a physical level. We're taught not to show things. We're taught not to cry, not to show those emotions. We're taught that you can only oftentimes show those emotions, especially in extreme circumstances. And so for me, that is a symptom of this system we've inherited that doesn't really benefit us. And there's no reason for why we were taught that thing. But it's something that for so many individuals are just willing to cling on to and say oh, we got to do this. Why? Right. And I think so many people, when you talk with them on the individual level, they'll be no, that's fine. I've been emotional with friends or loved ones or peers, and I can recognize that that's okay to do that. But then again, when you normalize in the group setting, it becomes this thing that people are so willing to fight for. And so I think a lot of times it's trying to help find those comparable examples for men that they can gravitate towards to really start to challenge for themselves the systems, right? Because we can talk about it, researchers can talk about it, experts can talk about it, but until the average people are having these conversations in their friend groups, it's not really going to change. But I think it's always a lot of times, like I said, trying to find really tangible examples of ways that we can challenge these concepts that don't feel so personal. Because I think a lot of times, even when people hear stuff like healthy masculinity versus unhealthy, their mind gets defensive. And they're oh, you're telling me I'm bad because I'm a man. And that's not the case at all. That's not what we're saying. It's saying you're adhering to or enabling systems that you may not even benefit from, that you were just taught to believe in. And giving those up cost you nothing and do nothing to impact your perception of what it means to be masculine. And so I think that's a huge piece of it. And in that work of just, like I said, teaching men how to identify that on their own. And then the last big piece, I think, is trying to make sure that men are better at also seeking out mental health and wellness services. We know there's a large stigma in male identified communities that exist around seeking out those services. Oftentimes it comes down to, again, ways we were socialized back when we were 6 or 7, where we were taught to solve our problems logically as opposed to dealing with them emotionally. The problem being that not everything can be solved through logic. It's not a puzzle. It is, sometimes we have complex things going on in our lives that need support services. And so trying to break through that just to normalize how we're approaching and discussing harm, and also trying to normalize not waiting until worst case scenario before we step in or engage. Because I think a lot of times I see people are like, well, if someone's doing this, obviously I'm going to step in. And I'm like, yeah, great. I'm glad that like when physical violence happens, you're going to step in. But like there's all these things leading up to it that we need to get better at recognizing and identifying and figuring out so we can provide that better support so we don't have to wait until things escalate to that point. Because I think there is an issue of men not knowing how to bring up and talk about and have conversations around these topics. And the result is it's hurting both them and the people around them. And so it's really trying to normalize like talking about and approaching these issues from a small perspective so that they get better at also challenging and talking about them from a larger perspective. So
certainly. Yeah. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, lots of great work, especially creating platforms for masculine identified folks to talk about these things and, like you said, challenging systems that are in place to change the norm in our society. So speaking of those comparable examples that you were talking about to help change and again challenge the systems, where do you think you still, or where do we still see healthy masculinity as less acceptable? And do you think that there's still, I mean, from the way that you were talking about it, it still seems that there still is an expectation in our society for males to adhere to the traditional stereotypes or fit into a man box. And so I was wondering if you could speak from the work that you've been doing, if you still see those expectations and where it's still unacceptable to get outside of the norm or traditional values of male.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of those like places where I see that happening are systems that almost rely and thrive based on being able to uphold and reinforce these kind of traditional and at times outdated concepts of masculinity, right? Where all of a sudden challenging and bringing in these new ideas almost is viewed as this kind of infraction or not, I don't want to say violation, but almost like a slight against that system, right? And so I know, not to go too far, but I think capitalism is one of those where we look at, and I think oftentimes organizations that exist heavily around like financial success are one of those places, right? So I think about like a lot of, sometimes places I do my work with is like tech companies and financial firms and things like that, where because there's this huge prioritization, you know, and as Magnus talked about earlier, like this self-efficacy and fiscal success, you know, that has oftentimes been tied to this idea of men as a breadwinner. And so it's one of those things that I think because of that and like the provider and, you know, one way you can show your worth is by being fiscally successful. And so I think a lot of times systems that rely on and thrive in that environment are oftentimes like, hey, it's better to be hyper masculine or to adhere to these rigid traits as opposed to embracing some of these other ideals. I think a lot of times also very male heavy and dominated groups where men are still and masculine identified individuals are still trying to form their identity is a huge one, right? And so I think that like as I look at different student organizations or, you know, athletic teams, I think that many times it's that there's values and inherently, again, are not wrong, right? So like I do a lot of work with student athletes and athletic teams in general. The thing I always tell them is like, look, for you, physical strength and competitiveness is something that you need because that's why you do what you do. And that's inherently not wrong. And I'm not the person to tell you that's wrong. It's that continuing to push that idea of what does this mean though outside of when you're actually competing or playing a game? What does this mean to, you know, do this outside of workouts or practice or when it's actually time to perform? And how are you enabling and embodying those traits in other ways, right? And then it's also trying to just push some of the stereotypes of like, can we also do this without the unnecessary comparison? And I think that's a huge piece of like trying to get people to realize so often masculinity is, I think, viewed as this negative, not just a negative thing from like society, but a negative more so in that many times I see masc identified individuals defining masculinity as a perception of we are not this, right? So we are not weak because we are not like women. We are not weak because of X, Y, and Z. We are not this, we are not that, right? And so many individuals lean into that. And so there's always this negative connotation of we define what it means to be masculine by pulling apart what is not masculine. And I think in groups that rely on that and have those rigid structures of like, we're masculine because we're not this, I think that's where it gets very dangerous and where it becomes very, you know, like it really reinforces a lot of those things, because those groups aren't trying to find their own definition of masculinity. They're defining masculinity through an absence of what they're not. And that's not to say that those groups can't figure out a way to do it, right? I've seen a lot of teams who've been able to remove that language. I've seen fraternities who've been able to be careful about how they are talking about these topics and to challenge what it means to be things like loyal and committed and all those kind of areas, right? Like I think in some of those places, if we over prioritize these values, it allows that harm to perpetuate. But once we can remove that idea of like, we don't have to define masculinity by what we're not being, we can still just be coherent and competent in what we are being. And so I think, yeah, a lot of times it's just looking at some of those bigger systems and like identifying, hey, like this system thrives based on traditional masculinity. What does it mean to like tweak that and challenge that and change that? And I think at any time, the hard thing is like, anytime you have a gathering of masculine identified individuals, it's going to pop up in some way, right? And it's like, it's also trying to get people to recognize that it doesn't mean it's terrible. You know, I was a fraternity man myself. Like, I'm not saying that it's one of those things where it's like, oh, these groups are awful. It's no, like just thinking openly about like, how are we expressing this? What does this mean? What are we doing in these areas? Because we have to have those honest conversations. Owning up and taking accountability for the potential harm we might be causing or the ways that masculinity isn't working doesn't mean we're bad. It means we're trying to have a good, positive conversation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I actually wanted to segue that and some of the other things you've been talking about into the idea of precarious manhood. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but for the audience and for yourself, there's a sort of theoretical idea being studied right now called precarious manhood, which is the suggestion that we view in a lot of societies cross-culturally, we view masculinity or being a man as something that needs to be defended, something that needs to be proven to other men and to ourselves, as well as to feminine identified individuals, because it's something that is about doing or something that is about not being feminine, kind of like what you just hit on there. So I guess I kind of wanted to ask sort of, what do you see as sort of the reasons that we might, in more masculine identified groups, sort of feel that need to define masculinity more traditionally, or why might we be a little bit more rigid in our definitions and approaches to masculinity and to health in those areas, if there's something you've experienced in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times the rigidity comes because it's benefited us, right? Like I think that's at the end of the day, that's part of what the rigidity comes from, is that if you are in a social structure or system where it has largely and overwhelmingly benefited you, why are you going to challenge it? And like, why are you going to be the person pushing for change if you feel like there's no harm to you, right? And that's recognizing that there is a lot of harm that we're now seeing that people have not learned how to articulate or express. Just because we didn't think it was harmful doesn't mean the harm didn't exist, right? But I think a lot of times it's this idea that like it was so often the benefit of, you know, what we were showing these ideas. And oftentimes I also think we have been sold, I think, you know, mask identified individuals in general have been sold this almost like bill of goods of like, if you do these things and you adhere to these ways, you will get success, right? And so like the figures we oftentimes lifted up and emulated fit into these categories and patterns. And we said, look at so-and-so, look at so-and-so, look at so-and-so. They're physically strong, they're stoic, they don't express emotion, they're fiscally successful, they do all these things. And we pointed to these individuals and said, don't you like to be like them? Mm-hmm. And so then we convinced people that if you act in those ways, you'll get what those individuals get, even though those people are oftentimes in a small percentage of the population that many people will never achieve, right? And so I think for a lot of people, it was this idea of like, let's adhere to these systems because we are going to eventually become that man that other masculine identified people will look up to. If we do this enough, if we enforce this enough, if we're strong enough, if we have enough partners, and if we are fiscally successful enough, we will become that pillar that other people in our community will look up to. And one day we'll be put on that pedestal, right? And when that was the only voice that was being amplified, when that was the only image that was being sold, so many people got it in their mind of like, I think both this almost desire of like, I deserve this and I need to enforce this. And so I think for so many people, they're unable to take away the fact that that was never true in the first place, or that was never something that was going to happen to them, that was also not the only way to get there. And just because the society was lifting up those individuals who fit in those parameters, and it was oftentimes neglecting so many of the other things that we were seeing. So I think a lot of times it's because people have been taught like this is what you have to do to see success, and that's especially in a individualistic society like the United States, that's something we strive for constantly. And then I think just on the smaller group dynamic level, it's that fear of standing out, and it's that fear of being ostracized, right? It's you see it across all ages. The second that you have someone who, once these masculine norms have been created, it's this fear of like, I don't want to stand out. I don't want to be the person that's called out. I don't want to be the person that's picked on or, somehow harmed. And so the idea is like, you just reinforce things time and time again because you want to fit into the group and you want to fit into the group that you're a part of, right? So you just constantly are willing to reinforce systems, even if they're not working. And I think that it's become this very kind of like perpetuating loop of habits and cycles, right? I mean, especially when we study mask-identified individuals from a very early age, they don't believe any of these things. Like literally, when you look at young enough kids, they just don't care about many of the things we're taught about. And then at a certain point, they're socialized to it. And we do it through all those different ways that we teach them to believe these pieces. And all of a sudden, there's this shift that we see in them where their relationships go from being very emotional and very powerful and very deep to, I don't talk about this with my friend because I don't want to appear to be weak and I don't want to be made fun of, and all of a sudden it's this loss, and it becomes this very perpetuating thing that, all these people believe. And so I think it's just this like really messed up cycle of like, it keeps happening. So we keep perpetuating it. So it keeps happening. I think a lot of it's trying to, as I mentioned, that's why it's trying to teach men that these systems don't work for them, right? Until we get enough people bought into it, like that's not going to change, right? Until we get enough people bought into like, hey, this doesn't actually benefit you and it's never going to benefit you. There's going to be people who are willing to defend it because even if they're not benefiting from it, they think they might be. And they haven't recognized how they're not yet. And it feels very personal to do that. So.
Yeah. And thanks for touching on that with the personability of it and just how sensitive it can be for a lot of people. I think that sheds a lot of light on why so many people are resistant to that change and to these conversations that need to be had. But when it comes to the future programming and sort of gaps in beliefs and in conversations and in willingness to talk about it, what do you think we can do to focus on more of the positive side? Like you talked a lot about sort of the areas where we fall short or we're unwilling to engage. And I see that a lot in the work that I do and a lot in the field in general. So with the future programming in mind, where do you see opportunities for talking about healthy masculinity or talking about what that could really look like and creating a template? Because we clearly have templates for the negatives. What does the positive look like? Where can it go? How should we program with that in mind for the future?
Absolutely. So I think there's a number of ways of like lifting up and celebrating times where these traditional or outdated concepts are being broken, right? And finding that within communities and really celebrating and highlighting those voices. I think that it is changing and challenging the stigmas that we see around us. And we're already seeing that. I think that we're seeing that in profound ways. So it's making sure those stories are coming up front, right? And, and making sure that we're elevating those stories and talking about them and talking about how it is happening. I look at a variety of, whether it's artists or individuals like that, I think just the way that we're talking about and having conversations on this is very different. I think some of it's probably going to be challenging and changing curriculum that people are going through in like primary and secondary education. So making it so that we're talking about these ideas much earlier on, but also having worked with a lot of younger populations, I can tell you like they are talking about this stuff, and it's profoundly amazing to see like where I'm talking to a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old who understands and is talking about things like gender identity and gender expression and gender orientation and all those kind of pieces, right? And they know these terms and they're very familiar with it. And I think it's making sure that we're educating younger populations on how to have these conversations in those areas. I think conflict resolution models are a really good thing to teach to mask-identified populations of what are ways to resolve conflict in relationships as well as in group settings. The reason I've seen a lot of success with that is it teaches how to, I think, get outside of some of the frameworks people are taught from a very early age of like, you have to approach a problem this way, or you shouldn't approach a problem this way, things like that, right? I think there's a lot of strides being made on a societal level on how we're supporting male-identified survivors of sexual violence in ways. I know that a mentor of mine and a man I've worked with on a board for a nonprofit I'm a part of, he talks about how in 2008, his own experience coming forward as a male survivor and as a celebrity had such a stigma attached to it. And, you know, for me coming forward in, you know, 2011, 2012 about my own experience was very different. You know, that's a few years difference, right? But it's still this very different experience between the two of us and how we both navigate our own experience, because I think that we're elevating those voices and bringing them in the front of the conversation. I think that a part of it is also, I see a lot more mask identified individuals being willing to come to and be a part of consent type conversations around like sex positivity and things like that. I think it's just some people are willing to have the conversation of like, this isn't mandatory for me and this isn't, you know, I have to be here, nor is it like worst case scenario, right? I think that's a huge piece as well, is getting people to recognize and talk openly about like, hey, we're not saying that you are committing sexual violence. Maybe we're just talking about the fact that you're continuing or perpetrating a culture that enables that, right? Which inherently all of us are through our own actions because the systems we're part of. But I think I've seen some like willingness for individuals to come forward and have those conversations, right? And I've seen a number of situations of populations where I've seen some really cool things happen. You know, I worked with a student athlete community where the teams organized an event where they had a panel and they had a variety of individuals from different sexual orientations and gender identities speak around what their experiences were. And you could text in questions to a moderator. And the panel was supposed to go a number of hours and it went over. And it was really compelling because people were just asking questions that they usually weren't necessarily searching for on their own. But it was really a respectful environment of just talking about different experiences and identities and educating people around what some of those things mean. And I think events like that focus on the, hey, we don't know everything and we're never going to know everything, but like, let's challenge what we do know in a healthy way, are continuing to emerge, right? I think we're seeing that from a younger age as well as more frequently happening. So.
Thank you so much for giving us more insights on future programming. Definitely gonna take some of those ideas and use them here at Tulane. And you also touched a bit about the roles that healthy masculinity plays in preventing sexual and power-based personal violence. I appreciate that. And also you talked about how to be a positive role model against unhealthy masculinity, which are some great skills that everyone could actually use if you're tuning in right now. We're going to skip down a little bit, and I was just wondering from your own, this is kind of a personal question, because it seems that you have found this freedom, but could you talk about maybe from your own experience what freedom from masculine or traditional masculine stereotypes looks like, and how you essentially cultivate healthy masculinity in your life every day?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the biggest pieces for me was teaching a lot of like vulnerability and also admitting and knowing it was okay to admit when things weren't okay, right? I think that as I looked at like just the way I was taught growing up, all these pieces, it was like almost like, and I'm also an artistic type individual. I love writing, I love art and things like that. I think like for many artistic individuals, even I think for masc identified artistic individuals, it's like you can be creative, but you have to fit in this box of like this self-destructive creative type, right? I think that's like even the negative stereotype. If like you can be creative, but we have to apply this value to it of like, you have to have trauma. And if you don't have trauma, you have to create trauma for yourself and others. And it's this like really messed up way we teach like creativity to masc identified individuals of like, yeah, you can love art, but it's got to be like dark and edgy, or you have to be suffering, or you have to be rude, right? And so I think for me, it was like a lot of that recognition of like, no, you can create things from a very healthy place. And like, you can recognize and talk about when things aren't okay, and like when things aren't, you know, not because anything's extreme, just like saying like, I'm not okay with this, or I'm not feeling okay, and recognizing that and owning that. I think about like some of my relationships I have with close friends, and I noticed like I had a group of 2 friends I was very close to from college onwards. And I noticed with the 2 of these individuals, like every time the 3 of us would say like, I love you, we always had to qualify with like, I love you, bro, or I love you, man. And like, so like I tried to challenge as a group to just say, I love you. Like not needing to like, even though it was just like this one word qualifier, I felt like it was just adding something in there. Like we couldn't just say, I love you. It had to be this thing of like, we had to qualify it, of like making it different. And so like, even that's a small challenge in recognizing the deeper level of conversations the 3 of us have and how we support each other has been really beautiful, of just saying like, oh, okay, we can talk about these things without adding qualifiers in, or some of those areas. And I think another piece that I've really appreciated and worked on is just, I think like body dysmorphia. I know a lot of mask individuals experience this. I've gone through it myself a ton. I grew up with these, every one of us did. We grew up with these very rigid ideas of what we're supposed to look like that are oftentimes unobtainable and insane. And I always hated my body and I hated what I looked like. And it was a long process of just recognizing and seeing like, I don't have to look a certain way and I don't have to fit like this and I don't have to do these things. And there was this very profound difference of recognizing this is what it means to be healthy versus this is what it means to look like how all these other individuals I was taught to look at were, right? Like, I think magazines like Men's Health are comical in how much they're teaching health from this perspective of like everyone who's on their covers looks the same. And it's one of those things where like, okay, like I get that your idea of health is like, and I've seen some shifts in that industry and what it's trying to do. But I think it's just this degree of like recognizing for myself, there's this profound moment of, and it's still working on it, but like, hey, I don't have to look like that and that's okay. And I don't have to have that kind of shape or body and that's fine, right? And like still recognizing also then the love that can come from it for yourself and from others of like, you can still be loved, you can experience love, and you'll actually, I think, experience a deeper, profound sense of like just happiness or belonging or contentment or whatever it is you're looking for, just in being able to challenge and push through some of those things, right? And I think the other really cool thing I've recognized is that, and this goes back to one of the points I said earlier of, I think men are wanting to do these things, because what I found is every time I've surrounded myself with a group of individuals and had these conversations, like people have also expressed similar concerns and have also talked about similar things, right? And, I was on a call with a few friends that we started at the beginning of kind of the pandemic and everything shut down. So we started doing a virtual call. And like, it was these 3 other male identified individuals. And inevitably we started talking about much deeper things. And it was really awesome to see like, hey, these are all of us having these conversations. And sure enough, we started opening up about body image issues. And then 2 of us were talking about it. And it became this thing where so many people were just like, yeah, I go through that too. And I think there's that willingness and the desire to be vulnerable, I think is a very profound ability that I've learned and worked on trying to cultivate, that I've also seen very strong results from.
I just knew the word vulnerability was going to come up in this conversation today. It just seems to be actually a theme amongst healthy masculinity conversations. So I'm happy that this is something else that has also helped you as well. I'm sorry, Magnus.
Oh, no. That's, I mean, I was going to touch on that as well. Just that it's good to keep bringing that up and to, align that or equate that to strength in a way and to health, really, to be able to reflect, to tweak like you talked about, and be open to constructive criticism and positive growth. So I appreciate that. And I think those are all excellent examples as well. I was wondering if you could possibly like share any resources that any audience members who might be struggling with that or looking for that avenue for growth or for support and trying to break free from sort of these rigid definitions that we have. You've provided some great examples on what to do in peer settings, but if there are any resources, possibly whatever peer group someone's a part of might not provide immediately for them, what could they turn to? What should they turn to that you might be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like one area that I always like to plug is 1 in 6. It's a nonprofit that focuses on male survivors of sexual violence. And I think that's a great place to look at if you are male identified and processing what it means to be a survivor. I think that's a great resource. They have a lot of online communities and events that they've set up. With that, I know it's Talkspace is an app that I've seen a lot of male identified individuals have success with. The reason I use that reference, and there's plenty out there. I just know that's the like main one, but just we know that male identified individuals are less likely to seek out wellness services. Oftentimes just the stigma alone of having to set foot in a building and making that physical act itself is enough to deter someone from seeking out those services. And so the thing we're starting to see is a lot of those like virtual therapy or counseling type applications have been really powerful because it gives people this ease of access of like, I'm going to do this on my phone and I don't have to go somewhere. I don't have to deal with that kind of stigma. I'm just going to schedule time and do that kind of stuff. Right. And so any degree of, like I said, virtual mental wellness or counseling, I think is a great way to look into it. 1 in 6 provides that for specifically survivors of sexual violence. But I know regardless, I think that's a great tool to have. The Descent of Man is a book that I love. that I think does a really good job of talking about some of these concepts from a high level perspective and kind of starting to break down some of those really, bigger picture ideas of kind of going in and figuring out some of the pieces of it. And it's a pretty quick read. It's very easy. Like, it just kind of talks about some of these concepts. It also has some good tools of like, here's how you can explore this for yourself. Here's how you can recognize this on your own. Here's how you can talk about this with other individuals, which I think is helpful for people if they're especially just coming to and starting this dialogue.
Definitely. Thank you for all those. It's great.
Thank you so much. We're almost finished here, but we wanted to know, how can we follow and stay up to date with the work that you are doing? If you want to plug any of your social media, website, YouTube, or anything like that, we'd love to hear all of the things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say most of my stuff is on my website. So timmousseau.com, TIMMOUSSEAU.com. And that's where I publish most of my writing and things like that. I have an Instagram. It's Tim_Mousseau. I am not good at social media. I post like once a year and that's it. I need to get better at it. I post a lot of stuff like videos, all my videos, blogs, things like that are on my personal website. And so like a lot of times if I do research, I'll post it up there. If I'm doing case studies on things, it goes up there. Just general thoughts on what's happening is always there. So I'd say that is the best way to follow up and get in touch with me. And my contact information's there as well. So yeah, otherwise I should be better at social media, but yeah.
To each their own.
Yeah. I'm not good at it myself either, so I completely understand that. So just to wrap up, you agreed to be a part of the Mentality Project today. So we just kind of wanted to ask you, what would you like to see this work take on and look like at Tulane in the future if you were to return, hopefully once COVID is all wrapped up and things are back to normal? What do you want to see everything look like, and what conversations would you hope to be hearing as a visitor to Tulane?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see more male identified individuals leading conversations around this topic, right? Like I sometimes have talks with individuals at programs where like, well, I don't agree with everything you said. And my challenge to them always is like, great, I don't need you to. I mean, most of it's research, so we can talk about that, but like more so start having this conversation on your own, right? Like if you don't agree with me, if you don't agree with the way it's being done, like how are you doing this? And how are you also doing it in a way that's challenging you, right? And I think that's what I would love to see, because I think sometimes I see that groups are doing this, but they're not doing it in a way that's provoking a challenge. And that's why that caveat, right? Like this shouldn't be a comfortable conversation. It's not going to be a comfortable conversation for any one of us, and that's okay. Like I think that's great to create spaces where it doesn't have to be comfortable, but we need to be having this conversation. And it's not that you need to agree with everything I'm saying, but I need you to be talking about it, and I need you to be talking about it in a variety of ways. I need especially male identified individuals to be leading these conversations, right? In their student groups, in their organizations, on their teams, with their peers, with their friends, in their own communities. I think just more proactive natures of like, I don't always know what the path is moving forward. If I did, I would have given that information out a long time ago. I just know we need to make some changes around these issues. And I think it just always excites me when I see those groups who are willing to do it, right? And I think it's also, a lot of times I talk with groups around this of like, be willing to be creative and have fun with this. Like this is a serious topic in a way. And I know, I'm glad you all did it earlier where you're like, hey, let's focus on the positive, because I can get very doom and gloom. Believe me, I know that's like my personality and stuff, but there's a lot of beauty that comes from this. And there's a lot of really profound impacts and positive things that can happen from this. And I think there's ways to have that challenge in a way that's fun and engaging. And I don't necessarily know what that is, right? And that's what I always tell campuses, like, I'm not in your generation anymore. I'm not, on campus. I don't know what that necessarily looks like. I can give you ideas of what I've seen on other campuses doing and stuff. But I think whenever I talk to like student groups, I'm like, what do you want to talk about? And they're like, well, what about this? And I'm like, cool, do an event around it. And they're like, really? Can we? And I'm like, yeah, right. Like you can still be sensitive and aware and, make sure you're being respectful. But like, if there's a way you want to approach this issue that seems best for you, do it. And have a conversation around it and engage in that type of conversation and talk about what that is for you, right? Like I think about prime example I always use is I worked with a fraternity that the way they educated around sexual violence is they set up speed dating with a sorority. And after the speed dating, they were given critiques of like, why would you ever think this was appropriate to say? Why would you ever, this is an appropriate language to use? Like, let's talk about these type of people, right? Now, the thing is that's very heteronormative, and I get that. I will completely own that. But at the same time, part of the dialogue they facilitated is why that is heteronormative, and to talk about why that isn't inclusive, and talk about what that means for members of their community so there's really profound dialogue around flirting and consent and what that looks like and what it means to be, the gender norms they're using and expressing and things like that, and heteronormativity. And they did this powerful conversation around it, and it was their most attended event. Is it perfect? No. Did it change the way they as an organization were talking about this conversation? Absolutely. Did they get full attendance to it? Yeah. Was it a difficult conversation to challenge some of their heteronormative pieces and to talk about some of the perceptions they had? 100%. Did a lot of profound things happen in that room? Yes, absolutely. Right. And I think that's the thing I always like to highlight of like, there are ways that we have to get people to this conversation. And everyone has different experience levels in this conversation, but we have to make sure we're welcoming people to it so that they feel like they can learn and progress through it. And so I think, like I said, if groups on campus can be the ones leading this, like it's legitimately, like, I love hearing about new innovative ideas, because it's like, as long as you're putting the due diligence in beforehand, I think oftentimes you can come up with really creative ways of talking about this that, really just resonate with you and brings people to the conversation, right? Because we have to be having the conversation, but we have to also get people to that conversation. If it's just the three of us or people who are watching along live right now and it's always the same, then it's like, we need to get new voices,
Absolutely. And thank you for that. We definitely need to be more welcoming and also more encouraging in these conversations. I think you're exactly right that, no one person has the right answer. No one person can see the future of what this is going to look like. So it would be better to have that more democratic process where everyone's taking their different approach and doing it in a way that's hopefully more constructive and more encouraging for other people like them to come to the conversation and learn something and tweak their behavior just a little bit more. So I think a lot of the resistance to these conversations that I touched on earlier is in part because, like you said, a lot of guys want to cling to, a lot of masculine identified people want to cling to what they've been sort of indoctrinated into and what also benefits them, but they don't see an outlet for a conversation that might allow them to keep some of those things that they value that might not be inherently bad, while also opening the door for more positive change and slight reevaluation of some of the things that are negative. So I think definitely more masculine identified representation in leading these conversations would definitely benefit Tulane and a lot of people in general. So thanks for touching on that.
Of course. Yeah. Like I said, that's why we always have to have that challenge piece, right? Like it's, because I want to be very careful. Every time I talk about masculinity, it's like, there are some bad opinions and perspectives out there, right? Like we know there's some very harmful and negative perspectives of it. And one of those things where I'm like, I think that's where it's like the challenge piece of like, hey, we can always be challenged, and it doesn't have to be bad. It's a very positive thing, especially if we come knowing that and welcoming it, right? It's that idea of like, we're learning and growing, and it just makes it better for all of us as long as we're willing to embrace that mentality.
100%. Yeah.
Thank you so much again for joining us today. It was a wonderful conversation. It was a pleasure to get to know you a little bit more and the work that you're doing. And I know I learned so much on how to continue to do this work. I'm sure Magnus has as well. And hopefully the ones that are listening right now, I hope that you guys also took away some skills, some tips, and just some thought points that will help you to, like Tim said, have these conversations on your own. Challenge folks. It's not going to be comfortable, but this is the way that we are going to cultivate healthy masculinity in our society. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add before we wrap up, Magnus.
That hits on everything for me. If Tim has one final thing he wants to say, or just any closing remarks.
Yeah, I think just the closing thing is we also don't always have to, I think for people who are listening who are like, how do I do this? Not every conversation has to start with this like firm opening of like, let's talk about masculinity. Sometimes it's ways to like, I think it's always trying to find ways to like bring this into conversations and then maybe bringing it up later, right? Like I think that's the key I have is, especially if you're dealing with someone who's very stubborn or rigid in it, you know, being like, let's talk about your masculinity is not like the way they're probably going to be welcome to the conversation.
Not at
versus
all.
being like, hey, at the end of the conversation, maybe being like talking about their values or what they're doing or expressing, and then being like, hey, I think that kind of dealt with the topic of masculinity. I really enjoy talking about it. I think sometimes can really warm people who are resistant to the dialogue, right? And so just knowing there's many ways to do it without like just firmly leading in with the let's challenge and talk about masculine HR. Sometimes it's just like talking about that person thing, talking about those pieces, and you know, thank you Simone for sharing, and then being like, and that was a great conversation around that topic. So
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
No problem. And we'll see you guys next week for another episode of Mentality Mondays. Thanks again for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.